Lou Scheimer was on vacation in Hawaii because it was hiatus season. And Arthur read my short stories and sent them to Lou via FedEx. And then in the interim, I come in with the premises, and Arthur looks the premises over and he goes, well, they're close enough. I mean, he's clearly got the ability to tell a story. And he leaves the premises on Lou's desk. So when Lou comes back from Hawaii, he's got my premises sitting on his desk. And Lou called up Arthur and said, I really don't know who we should hire. If we should hire the guy who wrote the short stories or the guy who wrote the premises. And Arthur said, they're the same guy. And Lou said, get him.
You are listening to the Act One podcast. I'm your host, James Duke. Thank you for listening to our little podcast that can. If you like what you hear, be sure to subscribe to our podcast and leave us a good review. My guest today is screenwriter and author Buzz Dixon. Buzz Dixon writes oddball TV, movies, games, comics, novels, putting words in the mouths of Superman, Batman, Conan, the Terminator, Optimus Prime, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Mork and Mindy, Scrooge McDuck, Bugs Bunny, Yosemite Sam, plus more G.I. Joes and My Little Ponies that you can shake a stick at. His short fiction appears in Mike Shane's Mystery Magazine, the Pan Book of Horror Stories, National Lampoon, Analog, and numerous original and best-of anthologies. If you were a kid in the 1970s or 80s, there is a good chance Buzz wrote for one of your favorite cartoons. He's a wealth of knowledge, and we had a great conversation. I hope you enjoy. Buzz Dixon, welcome to the Act One podcast. It's great to have you on.
Thank you very much. I enjoy being here.
We were just chatting, and I was just saying how much I've been looking forward to this. You've heard this probably often, but I was looking at everything you've worked on in the past, and I thought, man, this guy wrote half my childhood.
Well, I hope it was the better half.
Yeah, it was. I mean, you worked on so many shows in the 70s and 80s at a time when animation was dominant in the Saturday mornings and what I call coming home, the afternoon block, coming home from school. And we would rush home. And so for me, I'll just give you a quick. So for me, afternoons after school were Transformers, G.I. Joe, He-Man, and then like a collection of either Thundercats or whatever else. But the mainstays for me were G.I. Joe and Transformers, and then of course Saturday morning was full of whatever the networks put out back then. So I just look back at that and I think, man, this guy. So you obviously have had a pretty varied career with all the different things you've worked on. I'd like to start, if we could, just kind of back at when you first got started. So I'd love to know, did you always want to be a writer? Was that something that you grew up passionate about? And like, what was that encouraged early on in your life?
Well, I wanted to be creative in some form. And as a little kid, I was always drawing pictures. As early as the third grade, I was trying to write stories. Believe it or not, I tried writing a science fiction stage play when I was in the third grade, and I quickly realized about like 2 pages in, I have no idea what I'm doing. So I stopped at that point. But I was always a creative kid. My family moved a lot when I was growing up. We lived in 20 different houses before I graduated high school. That'll give you an idea of how much we moved. And so almost every year I was in a brand new class with brand new classmates. And I gravitated towards science fiction fandom because the nice thing about science fiction fandom was you were never further away from your friends than the mailbox. Every time we moved, a change of address, and my friends were waiting for me when, we got to the new house. So getting involved in science fiction fandom, I became interested in writing science fiction stories. About age 13, I began seriously writing stories with the intent that I wanted to submit them. And I actually did start submitting when I was somewhere between 13 and 16.
And when you say submit, so back then, and what time period are we talking about? So like,
wow, this would have been 66 to 70.
So at that time, there were like fan magazines and things like that you could submit to.
Yeah. In fact, the very first published byline I ever got was in a magazine that's now, the magazine is now called Midnight Marquee, but back then was called Gore Creatures. Gary Svella was and still is the editor of it. And Gary published the first thing I ever wrote that I got a byline on. And
wow.
It was a critique on how fake rocket ship sets looked in most science fiction movies, because they were crappy. I mean, let's be honest. 1950s. I think Cat Women of the Moon. It has like a film reel hanging up in the wall. It's like, that's supposed to be science fiction. I mean, come on. But anyway.
Although. Mm-hmm. I just watched Forbidden Planet again the other day, and that movie holds up. That is a spectacular, and that set was unbelievable.
They spent a ton of money on that movie.
They must have. That set, I was so impressed with that set.
Oh, and well, do you know the origin of Forbidden Planet?
No. What's the origin?
There was a special effects company, Jack Rabin and oh gosh, what was the other guy's name? I'm blanking right now. The third silent partner was named DeWolf. I can't remember the name of the second guy in it. But anyway, it was a small special effects company. They mostly did titles and stuff like that for industrial films, but they had a clever way of drumming up business. They would figure out a really cheap, inexpensive special effect. They would write a story around the special effect, and they would pitch it to low budget movie companies. And when the company would buy it, they would get to do the special effects. So they did War of the Satellites for Roger Corman. They did Unknown World, which is about this tank-like thing crawling into the center of the earth. Mm-hmm. Monster from Green Hell, which had stop motion giant wasps in it.
Wow.
Let's see what else. Oh, Kronos, and Kronos. And they came up with this great idea for a movie set on a planet that was populated by invisible monsters, and their logic was impeccable. You can have as many invisible monsters as you want. And so they came up with this thing, and they pitched it to several low budget studios, but somehow a copy of the pitch wound up at MGM, and MGM was seeing how successful The Thing and The Day the Earth Stood Still had been for other companies. And they said, well, we ought to jump on this sci-fi bandwagon. And so they bought it, and they said, we're going to buy you out completely. We're not going to let you anywhere near the project. But so they bought them out, and that became the genesis of Forbidden Planet, the idea of a planet full of invisible monsters.
It went from being a pitch to try to find the cheapest, most affordable way to do effects to being a really expensive effects.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tremendous, and it does. You look at it today and you just say to yourself, this is an artifact of the 1950s, so it reflects that design sensibility, that level of knowledge about science and psychology that they had then. But once you do that, it's like, well, this movie it hangs together. It really works.
Does. It really does. And I think that and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off as you were. Okay. We'll get back to you. But isn't that what great science fiction does? Is that, like, watching Forbidden Planet, it's dealing with these basic human themes that are universal in terms of our human condition. And science fiction does what's great about good science fiction is that it's deeply human, and that it's actually, which makes a movie from the 50s still still somewhat prescient today because it's dealing with issues of fear of the other, fear of the unknown, the idea of control and power and manipulation. These are all things that we deal with, every generation and every time, right?
Yeah. This is one of the reasons why a lot of 80s sci-fi films, lower budget sci-fi films, don't hold together, because they had no consideration of this. It was just how fast can we knock out an imitation of something somebody else did. So
let's get back. I expect we're gonna enjoy talking about all these wonderful things. But back to, so you submitted to started submitting to these fan fiction magazines, and
fanzines, and also professional science fiction magazines. I mean, I submitted to Galaxy, If, Fantasy and Science Fiction, Fantastic, Amazing. These were all digests at that time. Fantasy and Science Fiction and Analog are both still being published. It took me 50 years, by the way, but I finally cracked Analog. But I was writing stories for them, submitting them, and spending a small fortune in mailing fees, because back then you had to put it in a self-addressed stamped envelope so they could send it back to you when they would reject it. And I went through a lot of mailings, let's just put it that way.
Wow.
But that's what you need to do as a starting writer. You need to write, you need to submit it,
and get feedback.
And a lot of times today, they have fan fiction sites where people can literally post anything, and you get the feedback directly from readers, which is better than nothing. But it really helps when you have editors who will write back to you and say, I'm rejecting this, but here's why, and they would give you an insight. I mean, I don't have the letter anymore, but John W. Campbell of Analog, and he was like one of the greats of science fiction. He goes all the way back to the 40s. He wrote Who Goes There, which is the basis of the Thing movies.
Oh, wow.
Campbell goes from like the 40s up through the 70s. And when I was in the Army, I submitted a story to him, and he actually wrote back like a 2-page letter, 1 or 2-page letter, where he said, I'm rejecting this, but I like the thinking on it, and here's why I'm rejecting it. And it was a very good insight, because it gave me, said, okay, here is where I'm deficient. Here's where I need to apply myself.
Wow.
I had been, I'll give you a really brief recap to get me into animation so we can move along. I wanted to be a movie director when I was in high school, and I was writing scripts and short stories, but the ultimate goal was to be a director. And in 1972, I was drafted. I tell people I won a lottery that gave me a free, all expense paid trip to Korea, which was lucky because I met my wife there. So I'm not knocking that. But in any case, I was drafted in 1972. The Army figured, well, he can string 3 words together, so let's make him a newspaper editor. And I ended up Post newspaper for a year, and then I was on the I was the, what would you call it, the NCOIC, non-commissioned officer in charge of public affairs for the 4th U.S. Army Missile Command, not for U.S. Army Communications Command. The Missile Command was the Post newspaper. It was with the U.S. Army Communications Command, which I was writing press releases and stuff that got, anonymously, but it would end up in like Time Magazine, Newsweek, things like this. So I had a chance every day to hone writing skills.
Yes.
And 99% of the time it was what we called grip and grins, where, somebody's getting an award and you just write the caption of these two guys shaking hands. But it gave me a chance to work at writing. And
especially even something even that specific where it's everything's similar, you have to figure out how do I say the same thing differently?
Oh yeah. It is a challenge. In any case, when I got out of the Army in 78, I was married. We had a child. I had been accepted by the University of Southern California to their film school, but the film school wouldn't start until fall. And I was discharged in February. So my wife and I decided we'll come out to California. I would try to find a job in the movie industry as a driver or in the mailroom, gopher, something like that, just to get my feet wet until school started.
Yeah.
And I literally started at Universal Studios, just handing my resume out. And I started there and I worked my way all the way down to Filmation Studios. Filmation wasn't 100 on the list. It was literally 98. I'm not kidding. And so I go into Filmation Studios and I've got my resume and go up to the receptionist. This is probably March, early April, 78. And I go in and I say, I'm looking for a job and I'd like, who can I give my resume to? And the receptionist said, well, are you looking for a job in animation or live action? Well, I don't know anything about animation. So I said, well, live action. And she says, wait a minute. And she takes my resume and she goes in the back and then she comes out and she says, Arthur will see you. And this is Arthur Nadell, who was the producer of the live action shows at Filmation Studios, because Filmation primarily did animation, but they also did a number of live action shows. And it turns out it was hiatus season. And in animation, hiatus season was that period between the time you finished the last show that had been bought for the previous season, but the networks had not yet started buying shows for the next season. So there was like a 3-month period where nothing's happening. And if the studio was big enough, they would keep you on and you would be developing ideas for them. If they weren't big enough, they would cut you loose. And at Filmation, it was virtually a ghost town at that point. And Arthur was sitting in the back with nothing to do. And he goes, yeah, send this guy back. Give me anything to kill an afternoon. So I go back and I met Arthur. And Arthur, I got to say, one of the sweetest gentlemen I've ever met in the business. Arthur was just a wonderful, nice person. And we struck up, a good rapport with one another. He was asking me about what I had done in the Army and my plans and this and that. And I mentioned I had written a number of short stories. I hadn't sold any, but I had written them. And he said, well, if you're ever around here again, drop off, your short stories. I'd be happy to take a look at them. Well, you don't have to hit me over the head with a shovel. I go back to the apartment where we're staying. I dig out my short stories from the suitcase they're buried in. And about a week later, I go back and I say, well, Arthur asked to see these, and say, okay, go on back. I go back to see Arthur. He thanks me. And then he says, we've got a show we're developing and we're having a difficult time coming up with premises for it. So now I can't ask you to do any work because if I do, I have to pay you. But if you on your own were to come up with some ideas and wanted to show them to me, I'd be happy to take a look. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. So, again, you don't have to hit me with a shovel. I go back, I pull out my typewriter. I spend about a week coming up with 6 or 8 ideas. And a week later, I go back and I drop the ideas off with Arthur. What I didn't know was this. Lou Scheimer, who was with Norm Prescott, was one of the 2 principals at Filmation. Lou Scheimer was on vacation in Hawaii because it was hiatus season. And Arthur read my short stories and sent them to Lou via FedEx. Now, this is 1978. Sending something FedEx
Hawaii.
to Hawaii is a big deal in 1978.
Yes.
He sends my short stories to Lou in Hawaii. And then in the interim, I come in with the premises, and Arthur looks the premises over and he goes, well, they're close enough. I mean, he's clearly got the ability to tell a story. And he leaves the premises on Lou's desk. So when Lou comes back from Hawaii, he's got my premises sitting on his desk. And Lou called up Arthur and said, I really don't know who we should hire, if we should hire the guy who wrote the short stories or the guy who wrote the premises. And Arthur said, they're the same guy. And Lou said, get him. And so Arthur said, would you like to write, a script for us? And well, sure, absolutely. So this is maybe April, early May of 78. I wrote a script for a show called, Starlight and Moonlight, Starlight and Sunlight Bright, something like that. Jebusite and Amalekite, I can't remember. But the premise was there were two twin sisters, one of whom got her powers from her superpowers from the night, the other one who got her superpowers from the daytime. And so, of course, obviously, you've got to do stories where the switchover is crucial to what's happening. And that proved a very difficult show for people to come up with ideas for. And even though I wrote a script for them that they bought, they ended up canceling the show before it even went into production. So it never went anywhere. But I at least got my foot in the door. And after I wrote the first script and they saw that I could write fast and well enough to be edited, because I was terrible in those days, I'm going to be honest. I had a story editor, Len Jansen, who worked at Filmation, get so ticked off at me one time. He tried to smash my head against the wall with a coat rack. And I have to say he was justified. Okay. He was not being unreasonable at that point. But yeah, we had stuff going on. Filmation. Anyway, I got the gig writing for Filmation. And when fall came around, and most of the other people were put on hiatus, they said to me, we'd like you to stay and develop story ideas for us. So I'm thinking, I'm making a living, I'm paying my rent, I'm taking care of my family. I'll put off college until next year. Next year never came.
Wow. So you were accepted in the USC and never ended up going.
Never ended up going there. No.
Wow. That is. So back then, Filmation had they were a production company that would sell shows to, I guess back then it was just the networks. Was it just CBS, NBC, ABC back then?
Yeah.
And so they would sell shows. So they were selling live action and animated.
Right.
And so when you started developing stuff with them, what was the transition from live action to animation for you?
Well, the transition occurred before I got there, and I never got a chance to write live action for them. I was at one time in the live action studio because they needed space for animators in the regular studio, but I never got a chance to write live action for them. But I hung around with Arthur and all of the people working there. They had figured out a way of doing inexpensive action adventure shows on Saturday morning.
Yep.
They did ISIS, they did Shazam.
Yep.
A friend of mine, Michael Reeves, came up with the brilliant idea that ISIS could make things not happen. So, she would show up, the dam's going to burst, and she would go, damn, don't burst. And, it's like, there's any number of things you can stop from happening, and
it's like the invisible monsters from Forbidden Planet.
Exactly. They loved Michael. I mean, they'd hire Michael to come in and have as many things not happen as you can think of.
That's awesome.
But they did these shows on a low budget, but they did them with a sense of style, and they did them with a sense of there was depth to them. It wasn't just knocking out pointless action adventure. The one thing that Filmation had going for it in those days, they got their start when CBS wanted to do, I think it was CBS, wanted to do a Superman animated show. And they approached Hanna-Barbera, and Hanna-Barbera said, our plate is full. We can't put another show in production. And Lou Scheimer was working as a background artist for Hanna-Barbera at that time. And Lou heard about this, and he approached CBS and said, I can put a studio together and we can do, the Superman show for you. And he partnered up with Norm Prescott and I want to say Dan Christensen. I may be wrong here, so don't hold that, as authoritative information. But anyway, they put together Filmation Studios. Norm was an old radio guy who, when I say radio, I mean DJ guy, who got into voiceovers and had actually produced an animated film separate from Norm. He did Pinocchio in Space. And so they got together. It's not a bad movie, actually. I mean, when you look at it as a cheap 1960s animated feature, right, you go, okay, for what it is, it's not bad.
That's good.
Anyway, they put together the Superman show, and they were notorious for they were determined to make money at every stage of production. Hanna-Barbera did what was called deficit financing. The studio would give them, the network would give them $250,000 to do an episode that would really cost $500,000. So they would go out and find a bank and they would borrow $500,000 to do that episode. Then the hope was at some point in the future, you sell it as a syndication package and you make your money back that way.
Got it.
Normally will work, but sometimes you get a really terrible show and it doesn't, and you end up losing money. Lou, and God bless him, Lou was a union guy. Even though he ran the studio, he was a union guy. He insisted on using union talent, but on keeping the budget so low they would make a profit even off $250,000 budget. And so they used every trick in the book to keep the costs down. Just ridiculous stuff. You look at it now and it's funny to see just what the cost saving things they were doing. When they did the Archie show, almost all the dialogue was shot over the back shoulder of whoever was talking. So here's Archie talking to Mr. Weatherby. And then you cut like this, and here's Mr. Weatherby answering Archie. You never see their lips moving. You only see the person they're talking to.
You didn't have to animate the lips moving. That's good.
Yeah. And when they did the Star Trek animated show, they would come into these tight close-ups of eyes so they don't have to show mouths moving.
That's the reason why I remember those tight shots.
And they loved characters with masks because then you don't have to do lip syncing. And they would go through and they would storyboard action scenes, and they would give the writers these big thick notebooks of action scenes and say, when you're writing a script, go through and call out specific action scenes that we've got animated, and we will use them again. I wrote one episode of Brave Star, and I've never seen any other episode of Brave Star, and I'm sure it's a good show. I know people who worked on it. I am not putting it down, but I know if I see a second episode of Brave Star, I'm going to realize how much same as animation was in my episode, and it's going to disappoint me. So I only have watched my episode of Brave Star, and I'm going, hey, pretty good. I like that.
All right, I'm going to tell you how pathetic I am, Buzz. I watched way too much television when I was a kid. I can sing to you the Brave Star theme song. And my favorite thing about Brave Star, I'm going to save you and the audience that, but the theme song was all his animal powers, right?
Yeah.
So eyes like a hawk, so Brave Star, eyes like a hawk, ears like a wolf, Brave Star, strength of a bear. And then the one that always made me laugh, even as a kid, is it wasn't the speed of a cheetah, it was the speed of a puma. And I always wondered, why did they go with the puma?
Might have been hopes for a tie-in. I mean, there was a Puma brand shoe at that time.
Anyway, that's my Braveheart connection. Hey,
yeah.
So when so here you are writing for Filmation, and man, yeah, boy, they churned out a lot. What was your first professional screenwriting credit that aired?
Geez. It would have been a segment of a show called Tarzan and the Super 7, which, no matter how you count the configuration, does not equal 7. They had their Tarzan show, and they edited it down from a half hour to a 20-minute episode so they could add other segments. It was like an hour-long show, and I think Space Academy premiered on this too. I'm not 100% sure. Space Academy might have been Space Academy, or it might have been the serial version of Jason of Star Command, because they did a live action serial. In any case, I wrote at least one Freedom Force episode. I wrote a couple of Manta and Moray and Super Stretch and Micro Woman episodes. I wrote a Web Woman episode, and we would get sued like nobody's business, because Marvel and DC, once they found out we were doing these shows, they double teamed us, and they sued Web Woman, claiming that we were infringing on Spider-Man and Black Widow. And they actually had a point, because her original costume looked a lot like Black Widow's costume at that time. So we had to change it from a logical looking quasi commando outfit into this ridiculous fishnet stockings and tights thing that was on the air.
That's so much more acceptable to put the woman in the fishnet.
Exactly, yeah. Super Stretch and Micro Woman got sued by DC because they said we were emulating the Atom and the Elongated Man.
I totally remember that. I think they would show that on some other later on. I totally remember that show, Super Stretch and Micro. Yeah.
And Marvel sued because they said you're ripping off Ant-Man and Mr. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Marvel and DC both sued over Manta and Moray. Marvel saying you're ripping off Namor, and DC saying you're ripping off Aquaman. And I told Lou, I said, for heaven's sakes, just tell Marvel and DC's lawyers, decide which one of you is getting ripped off, and we'll take the winner on.
Now help our audience understand. So back then, I mean, it's still today, but they do it differently now. But if I remember correctly, and please correct where I'm not remembering right, but back then the networks were required to put X amount of, I don't know if it was through the FCC or something, but they were required to put X amount of hours on television that were considered educational or for children.
Exactly.
And so the Saturday morning, so they would basically just hire companies like Hanna-Barbera and Filmation to just create blocks of TV for them. So the reason why, like you're talking about, the reason why there were so many different characters is that Filmation would literally have 4 hours on CBS that they had to fill, and they would just rotate through characters that worked or didn't work. But literally they had a block they had to fill.
Oh yeah.
That they were contracted by CBS, ABC, or NBC. And they had all these different shows on all these different characters, and some hit and some didn't, and they would just kind of keep rotating through. But it was, the networks didn't produce it themselves because they didn't care. They just were trying to fulfill their requirement. Is that right?
Right. Almost never did a network directly produce a show for Saturday morning. There are a few exceptions, but they're not, significant. They would certainly put pressure on a studio to do a certain type of program, a certain type of way, but they rarely got their hands dirty actually doing the production themselves. We had, as I said, a real problem at Filmation with just getting sued by people left and right. And one of the examples was kind of heartbreaking to me. There used to be a comic strip called Tumbleweeds done by a guy named T.K. Ryan. And Tumbleweeds was just this really funny, really witty takeoff on Old West tropes. I mean, it was every Old West cliche parody you could imagine. And I loved the comic strip. I was a big fan of it. And Lou sold a show to NBC called The Fabulous Funnies, which, to be perfectly honest, was neither. And most of the stuff he had was like really old. I mean, it was like the Katzenjammer Kids, Alley-Oop, Nancy and Sluggo. He got Broomhilda, and he also got, he said, Tumbleweeds. And when I found out he had Tumbleweeds, I immediately campaigned. I said, I love this comic strip. Let me do it. Let me write it. And I figured out a way of including the Native American characters into it, because even at that time, Lou would not hire someone to do an ethnic voice if they weren't that ethnic person. And about the only ethnic actor anybody knew in Hollywood at that time for Native Americans was Iron Eyes Cody, which, if you know, was not a Native American. He was Sicilian descent, but he really loved the Native American people. He became, I won't say he was delusional, but he certainly embraced that culture. He championed for their rights and protection. And as I recall, at least 2 tribes formally adopted him as a blood brother and
wow,
to the tribe because of all the work he had done. But yeah, he was Sicilian. He was not Native American, but he would be the only person that they could afford if they were going to do a Native American voice. And so they didn't want to have any Native American characters in Tumbleweed. And I said, well, you've got 2 characters in the strip who are mute. They never say anything. You got this big guy, Bucolic Buffalo, and then you've got this little scrawny guy called Lots of Luck. And Lots of Luck would write notes and hand them to people in the strip. And once they realized, well, Buzz knows this and he can include the Native American characters in a way that we don't have to hire an extra voice, they gave me all the scripts to write. So I was in hog heaven. I was going to do at least 4 scripts for Tumbleweeds. And I had written the first 2 scripts. The first episode had been animated. When the show premiered, it was on that morning, and his Tumbleweed's face was in the lineup. And Monday, we got a call from T.K. Ryan's lawyer saying, Mr. Ryan really liked the episode. He's just wondering why you never got a contract with him. Because apparently what had happened, Lou's lawyer had contacted Ryan and said, we'd like to do a Tumbleweeds animated show. And Ryan said, okay, send me a storyboard so I can see what you're going to do with it. And if I like it, I'll say yes. And the lawyer just went, he said yes, and never followed up. And so we animated and aired a show that we had no rights to. And that was a disappointment because I was having fun doing it, but it got yanked. So
Man, I can't imagine doing all that work. And then, but it was a little bit of the Wild Wild West back then, I guess.
Yeah.
Because they had to put out so much and they were so used to getting sued by Marvel and DC, probably they weren't that worried. So your career is pretty varied in terms of, I mentioned that earlier. You've written on so many shows. Can you explain what the process was for writing because literally Alvin and the Chipmunks, Dungeons and Dragons, Scooby-Doo, Thundar the Barbarian, Heathcliff, of course, G.I. Joe, Mr. T. I remember that show. Oh my gosh. Of course, Transformers, G.I. Joe. What was the process for writing animation back then? Were you working for Filmation, or were you writing stuff on spec? Would you get called and say, "Hey, we need," as opposed to say a writer's room where you would sit around with a bunch of writers? How did it work? Did it vary from show to show, or what was the process like in writing for all these TV shows?
Well, the answer to those questions is yes. Every show that I got involved in a different way. And nonetheless, there was a great deal of overlap. I worked 2 years at Filmation, and then they had a dry spell and they couldn't keep as many people on for hiatus as they wanted to. And so they turned me loose and they said, stay in touch. We'll want to hire you back when we go back in production. And I was trying to find work, to keep, the roof over our heads. And someone said, well, why don't you try Ruby Spears? They're a struggling young company and they're trying to get scripts written. So I, contacted Ruby Spears. I forget who the story editor was at the time, but they gave me the show Bible on, I think it was Dingbat and the Creeps. I may be mistaken. It might have been Mighty Man and Yuck. Might have been Mighty Man and Yuck. But in any case, they gave me a Bible and said, come up with some ideas. And so I came up with a couple of ideas and they said, okay, this one will work. And they bought it from me and I wrote it as a freelance script. And they said, you got any more? And I said, well, give me a chance. And I wrote a few more. I think I wrote around 3 or 4 as a freelancer. And then they said, well, we're going to be gearing up soon for regular season production. Do you want to come on board as a staff writer? So I agreed. And then Lou called me and said, I'd like to have you come back. And I said, well, Ruby Spears is offering me this much money. Can you meet it or beat it? And he said, no, I can't do that. I'm sorry, best of luck. And he, let me go, which is unfortunately for Lou, what happened with a lot of his talent.
Yeah.
They used to say Filmation was where, it was for people on their way in or their way out of the industry. It was either newbies who were learning the ropes and who would soon go on to bigger and better things, or it was old guys who were burned out and that was the best they could do. Anyway, I ended up on staff at Ruby Spears. I think the first staff writing I did was for Mighty Man and Yuck. I met Steve Gerber there because they brought Steve Gerber on board. Steve was in the middle of his lawsuit against Marvel Comics. He was trying to claim ownership of Howard the Duck. And Steve was doing a comic book called Destroyer Duck, which was one of the earliest self-funded independent black and white comics. Excuse me, it wasn't black and white, it was full color. My goodness, I'm misremembering here. It was a full color comic. And he was using that to fund his lawsuit against Marvel. And Steve, and I'm not speaking ill of him here because Steve and I were great friends, but the truth is Steve frequently had deadline problems. Yeah. And on more than one occasion, he would call friends up and say, can you help me out and, move things down the block? And he said to me at one point, he said, I've got to finish the script for this issue. And we've got Jack Kirby, drawing it. I need you to write a 2-page fight scene for Jack to draw while I'm finishing the rest of the script.
Wow.
And so I go, okay, sure. I write a 2-page fight scene, and I tell people my first job in comics, I wrote something that Jack Kirby illustrated, and it's been downhill ever since. But no, I wrote this thing for Jack. Didn't meet Jack at that time, but I wrote it for him. And then, strike that. I had met Jack at that time. I had met Jack. I'll tell that story in a moment.
Okay.
In any case, I'm on staff. We're developing ideas. We're writing scripts. Somebody came up with the idea of Thundarr the Barbarian.
Just somebody. I love it.
Well, here's the thing. Joe would say very concretely, I came up with the idea. And I believe Joe probably had the germ of the idea. Steve would argue, no, I came up with the general shape of it. Once we decided to do a Barbarian in the Future story, I crafted it as to what it would be, with input from people like Marty Pasco and Mark Evanier, who all had been in the room when the development was going on. Marty was the guy who contributed the name Ookla for
Ookla, yes.
Yeah, because when Marty was in Paris, young Parisians kept asking him, well, where do I get an Ookla shirt? UCLA.
That's the origin for Ookla. I had no idea.
And I was there, but I wasn't involved in the immediate genesis of Thundarr. But once the general idea was developed, and once they got to go ahead to do more formal development on it, Joe had a big meeting. All the writers came in, the heads of the storyboard and design departments came in, and we're discussing the show. And Steve said, I know a guy who would be perfect, to design the show. He said, let me call him and I'll bring him in and we'll, get him involved. And so we had a meeting scheduled for the next week or a few days later, a big meeting where we were all going to get together and just hammer out all the details of the show. So when the meeting comes around, I come in and into the conference room, and John Dorman, who was the head of the storyboard department, was already in the conference room, and he's talking to this little old man. And I tell people, you heard the expression that somebody's eyes were twinkling. This is the only person I've ever met whose eyes literally were twinkling all the time. I mean, just, you could see like ideas sparking behind them. And so I come in, and John doesn't introduce us, to each other. And I figure, well, when the meeting starts, we'll probably all go around the table and introduce ourselves. So I didn't get, concerned about it. And gradually, one by one, everybody drifts in until finally Joe shows up, and we sit down, and there's no introductions. Everybody just, starts contributing to the meeting. And the little old guy and I struck it off really well, because I could tell right away he had great ideas. He was plussing stuff. He was developing, just verbally developing stuff and showing how you could expand things and this and that. And I recognized, wow, this is going to be a really cool show working on it with this guy, because he's really on top of things. And so the meeting goes on for about an hour or so, and then Joe says, okay, well, the writers will go and start developing scripts, and you guys in the art department, you go start designing stuff, and we'll meet again next week and continue from there. So I went into Steve's office after the meeting, and I said, I'm really fired up about this show. It sounds like it's going to be tons of fun. I said, but who was the little old guy in the room? Nobody ever introduced us. And Steve said, that was Jack Kirby.
Wow.
And if I had known it was Jack Kirby, my contribution to the meeting would have been, this was back before the internet. And I knew Jack Kirby by reputation, had no idea what he looked like.
So Jack Kirby is somewhat responsible for the look and design of Thundar as well?
He is responsible for like 90% of the design.
Wow.
Toth,
I had no idea.
Alex Toth and Doug Wildey did the initial designs on the characters. And you can find their stuff online. You'll look at it, and both of them did Thundar, Ariel, and Ukla in their personal styles. But, you can tell it's the same character. Jack came on board and started doing all the incidental characters, all the backgrounds, all the supporting characters and weapons and vehicles and everything else. We did a script where in one scene I had written that Ariel, Ukla, and Thundar cross a river on a raft ferry. You've seen these in Western movies. Somebody makes a raft, they've got a rope strung across the river, and you just pull your way across. And so I described a raft ferry, and Jack designs it. He comes back with the deck of an aircraft carrier on top of a raft of sequoia logs. And I took one look at this and I said, no, we are not wasting this as a throwaway background detail. I am building an entire script around this vehicle here. And that became the genesis of a script called Treasure of the Mocks.
Wow.
Because I put a pirate captain and her crew on it, and they're looking for the mock treasure, and they're going up and down the river. I mean, it was, Jack did this all the time. You'd ask him, give the guy, some weird weapon, and he would come back with something that was just like mind-boggling. And he just knocked this stuff off. I mean, it was just astonishing. In any case, Ruby Spears, for about a 3-year period, had what was widely regarded as the best story department in the business. And I'm not saying this to brag because I was part of it, but we just had top-notch people. We had Steve Gerber as story editor. There was myself, there's Gary Greenfield, Norman Maurer. I mean, there was just a lot. No, excuse me, not Norman Maurer. Norman was the director. Michael Maurer, his son. We just had a lot of really good people working there. Jack Anyart.
And you guys would all do multiple shows. So when you say when you say the story department, just give us a rough idea. How many shows was that story department contributing to?
It depended upon the season, because some seasons we would have shows that might have 3 different segments. And so instead of 13 episodes, you're really writing 39 segments because each one was independent of one another. Other seasons, we might have only 2 shows on the air, and you'd only do a handful of episodes.
I'm trying to remember, was Thundar a 22-minute show, or was it like an 11 minute?
It was a half-hour show. It was in a half-hour slot. It may have gotten trimmed down at some point in reruns so they could squeeze an extra public service announcement in or something like that. But it was always meant as a half-hour show when we were writing it.
Okay. And you would break it out as with commercials? Would that be like a 5-act?
Yeah.
Were all your shows written in 5 acts?
No, 3 acts. 3 acts.
Or 3. You would do 3. So you wouldn't consider them between each commercial break. You would just be. There were only 2 commercial breaks.
I seem to recall that we had 3 commercial breaks. I know definitely in the Sunbow material we had 2 commercial breaks. 3 acts, 2 commercial breaks separating the acts.
Okay.
I now you got me wondering. I can't remember if Thundar was 2 acts separated by a commercial, or if it was 3 acts separated by commercials. But basically, you knew you had only X amount of time to tell a story. And with animation writing, at that time, we were doing what was called directing on paper, where the writer would break the scene down for the storyboard department, literally movement by movement. Camera goes in, camera comes out. This character does that, and call every shot close up on this, far angle. And you literally had to visualize the entire story in your head and break it down for the storyboard department. So our scripts would be twice as long as a live action script of similar length. If you did a half-hour action adventure show in live action, it would have run about 22, 24 pages at that time. Thundar scripts typically ran about 44 pages.
Wow. And explain to our audience, what was the animation process back then? Like how long by the time you turned in a script to the time it aired on television, what was the time that took?
When all cylinders were firing smoothly, we could get a show back in 6 weeks' time.
Oh, wow. 6 weeks. Okay.
But this means we already had a lot of same as animation. Even in Thundar, you'll notice they jump over the same tree every episode.
Yes.
We had a lot of same as animation. We had a lot of stock animation that we could reuse again and again. We had a good design team that could, design characters. We had a great storyboard department. I cannot overemphasize. John Dorman ran one of the best storyboard departments I've ever seen anywhere. And John was a wild man. Let me explain this. I mean, when you realize how good the stuff was and you realize how chaotic the office, the storyboard department was. But Jim Woodring, who is now famous as a alternate comics guy, he does the Frank books. Jim Woodring was a friend of John's, and he worked with John in the storyboard department. We had guys like Kurt Connor and Dan Reba, just tons of people working there. And I was one of the few writers who actually went down and talked with the storyboard artists and found out from them what made a script good for them. Because a lot of times people would write stuff and then the storyboard artists are going, oh crap, how are we going to draw this? How will we depict it? And I went down and I would say, well, what do you guys need? What makes your job easier? And they would give me advice. Yeah, write scenes that we can do this instead of, a more difficult and cumbersome way of doing things. I'll jump ahead a little bit. I'll tell you a story about a show called Turbo Teen.
Yes, Turbo Teen. I totally
remember. I dodged the bullet on that one. I was on Turbo Teen for all of 15 minutes, and Joe.
And just so people who don't know, and I'm sure there's some people out there. I know a couple of friends of mine that we joke about Turbo Teen. Turbo Teen was literally a show about a teenage boy who would transform. Was it because of water? So I can't remember what. He would transform into a race car, basically. Yeah. And very interesting concept.
This actually, the Turbo Teen story actually ties into Transformers, but specifically for John, I went over to see him one time for lunch, and he and the storyboard department were just sitting there glowering. And I'll clean up the language here a little bit, and I won't mention the name of the person responsible. But John went, God, Brink, Joe Blow. And they all started pounding their desks. Joe Blow had written a Turbo Teen script where Turbo Teen, as a car, climbs up on a high diving board, jumps up and down on the board as a car, executes a jackknife, dives into the pool, swims over to a rowboat in the pool as a car, climbs into the rowboat as a car, and they were expected to draw this. And that is why they were cursing Joe Blow for having written such a script.
Because nothing had been drawn like that before. So everything.
No. I mean,
and how do you draw a car diving into water? Yeah.
I got to say, John, I loved him like a brother. He was one of the original wild men of animation. I mean, he was bonkers. I got to be honest, but he was brilliant. He did great storyboards. But he and his crew were frequently chemically enhanced, and I think for shows like Turbo Teen, that was a necessity.
That was a necessity for Turbo Teen. I mean, even as a kid, I'm watching Turbo Teen going, "This is ridiculous." All right,
some of the episodes are on YouTube, and I invite people to try to watch an entire one, because you get about like 5 minutes into it, and you're going, nothing in this makes any sense at all.
Yes.
Thinking up.
And I remember thinking of that as like a 10-year-old or however it was I was. Yeah. Okay. You've done so many shows that I loved. I mean, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Mr. Alvin the Chipmunks. So there was this, so there was this transformational kind of moment in 80s. And I know you know so much of the backstory of all this stuff because you were a part of it. That's why I want to pick your brain on this. There's been some documentaries. There's been some stuff that's kind of come out. So I'd love to just hear your perspective. So Transformers. So for me, it was like 1A, 1B was my favorite shows were Transformers and G.I. Joe. And they were back-to-back weekdays. And I, memorized half the episodes of all of them because, back then they just went on repeat. And so for people who are familiar with the Transformers, they decided to make a movie. And, and just a reminder, all cartoons are back then and even now, they're all about selling toys, right? They're all about moving merchandise. And so Transformers wanted to make a movie. And I've watched the little documentary on the making of it, which is hilarious because the director, I don't know if you've seen it, Buzz, but the director of the Transformers, the movie, is like this Japanese guy. And he, like to him, it was like a paycheck. And he does not understand, even in the documentary, you can tell, why am I being interviewed about this stupid movie that I did that in his mind wasn't even that good? And you can just tell that he is just like, why am I? But, all these shows are so beloved now by people. So there was a controversy for us fans. I was there opening weekend. I forced my older sister, to take me to the movie theater and watch the Transformers movie. And we all were shocked when Optimus Prime dies. Spoiler alert there. And literally, like all of us kids are, why would you do that? And the Transformers show just bombs after that. It just has a huge effect on it because everyone's like, why would you do that? So in the meantime, I know that G.I. Joe is talking about making a movie. And then they see the response. So take us back to, because you were connected to all these people. So when the Transformers movie came out, so my first question to you is, was there already talk of doing the G.I. Joe movie before the Transformers movie came out?
Yes.
And talk a little bit about, so that's the other thing too. Yeah, you're the writer of the G.I. Joe movie, but your credit, and you can tell that story later too, your credit doesn't necessarily reflect that, but you're the writer of the G.I. Joe. So talk a little bit about the connection between the Transformers movie and the G.I. Joe movie, and then I'd love to talk to you about the specifics.
Well, if you don't mind, we're going to backtrack to Ruby Spears, because Ruby Spears is where the first domino starts falling that leads to Transformers and G.I. Joe. What had happened was in the 1960s, there was a show called Hot Wheels, and a parents group complained to the FCC about it, saying it was just a half-hour commercial for the toy. The FCC agreed, and they issued a ban that there could be no toy-based cartoon shows. You could have a cartoon based on a literary property, but you couldn't have one based on a toy. jump ahead about 15 years, and the Smurfs reach American shores as these little tchotchkes, keychains, good luck charms, stuff like that. They are immensely popular.
There was a woman at my church who had an entire room in her house of little Smurf figures. It was crazy. Yeah, they were huge.
Nobody in America knew their origin. Nobody knew where and how they were created. They were actually called, I think, Strumps or something like that. They were a Belgian comic book. But the toys hit America and they boom, big, huge, profitable thing. And I think it was NBC said, gosh, if only we could do a Smurfs cartoon show. And someone said, well, it's based on a Belgian comic book. And they said, oh, really? So they put the show into production. The FCC, you can't do that. And they said, oh, no, look, Belgian comic book. See, it originated here. And the FCC goes, okay, all right, fine. You're allowed to do it. So now other people are looking at their properties. And the strawberry shortcake people say, well, does greeting cards count as literary property? And the FCC goes, well, printed on paper. Yeah, okay, sure. They count as printed property. Well, all right. Now we got strawberry shortcake. So they do the strawberry shortcake series. And at that point, Mattel and Hasbro both go, oh, all it takes is a comic book. So Mattel approaches DC and they do the He-Man Masters of the Universe comic, a 3-part miniseries, which bears no resemblance at all to the show that got on the air, but at least let them say we've got a comic book it's based on. Marvel, Hasbro went to Marvel. They got Larry Hama to create the G.I. Joe series for him at Marvel, the comic. I forget who the team was behind Transformers, but they got Transformers going. While all this is happening, Hasbro is also coming out to Los Angeles and talking with every animation company because the end game is to get a Transformers and G.I. Joe TV series on the air. And I was at the time the giant robot bug, you might say, because every studio I worked for, I was championing, we got to do a giant robot show. They're big in Japan. They've got huge followings. This is something kids will like, giant robots. And everybody, buzz your nuts, shut up, go away. So anyway, Joe calls us into a meeting, Joe Ruby, and the Hasbro guys are there, and they've got this suitcase, and they open it up, and it is filled with Transformers. Because they had bought the licensing rights to like 3 or 4 lines of transforming toys in Japan. And they were going to mix and match them, and they were going to rename them and all this stuff. And they just had this suitcase full of transforming robot toys. And I'm sitting there trying to keep from bursting out with excitement, and they're talking with Joe. And in the end, the meeting ends, they close the suitcase, they walk off with it. And they are barely out of the building when I say to Joe, we have got to do this show. It is going to be huge. It's going to be great. It's going to be tremendous. You have got to get this show. And Joe goes, nah, I got a better idea. We're going to do a show about a teenage boy who turns into a car. And as I said, I lasted about 15 minutes on that show because when Joe got a Bible developed for it, he called us in for a writer's meeting. He gave us all copies of the Bible. He said, go back, read the Bible, and then start developing ideas. I got about halfway through the Bible. I tossed it in the trash can. I came back to Joe's office and I said, Joe, I'll develop ideas for you, but you got to explain a few things to me. If the kid is a car and they take the wheels off, if he turns back into a kid, is he missing his hands and feet? If the kid is a car and they take the battery out, if he turns back into a kid, is he missing his heart? If the kid is a car and they put a suitcase in the trunk, when he turns back into a kid and Joe goes, I'm putting you on another show. So anyway, we are going to jump ahead now. Ruby Spears, as I said, had what was regarded at the time as the best story department. But for reasons not related to Joe and Ken, they lost that storyboard department in about like 3 weeks' time. They had somebody who worked under them who managed to piss off the entire story department in a single afternoon. And we were like all on our phones calling our agents, get me a gig somewhere else.
Wow.
So this person basically hamstrung Ruby Spears by alienating all the writers in it. But that's a different story for another time. Anyway, Steve Gerber ended up working on Dungeons and Dragons. And I said to Steve, because we were friends, I said, can I pitch to the show? And he said, well, they seem to be closed. I don't think you can get in, but here's the person to contact. So I contacted them. And as a courtesy, because I, had been working in the business, as a courtesy, they let me come in and pitch a story, even though they were full at the time. And I pitched a story called Quest of the Skeleton Warrior, which personally I regard as a turning point in my own writing, because it was the first time I wrote about a villain who was a sympathetic villain who had an understandable motive. And you couldn't hate him. You go, well, we got to oppose him, but we understand perfectly well why he's doing this. He's not acting out of selfish, irrational reasons. And they liked it so much, they made space for it in the original series. And I ended up, being as a result, ended up being one of the writers on the original Dungeons and Dragons show.
I remember that show really well because it was a late. Okay, so this is once again, this is what you get when you're someone like me who watched way too much. Is you could watch the pattern of the shows on Saturday morning. They would get the later in the Saturday morning it would be more for older kids.
Exactly.
And Dungeons and Dragons was on CBS, and it was their late show that would, I think they paired it with the CBS storybook time or whatever that eventually went over to ABC, which was usually more tween or teen themed or whatever. Dungeons and Dragons was good storytelling. It was also really good animation. It was slightly different animation than even the earlier shows too. The quality of animation and the quality of the writing, it stood out to me as being, I don't know if I want to use the word more mature, but it definitely had a different quality to it. Would that be the correct way to say it?
Yeah, absolutely. It was a step up in quality all the way around. I was very happy to be involved in it. And as I said, I view it as a personal stepping stone where I moved up as a writer one notch in being able to write stories about characters who are a lot more complex than the typical, supervillain that you encounter. In any case, from there, I freelanced around a little bit, and Steve ended up being hired to story edit the G.I. Joe TV series. Now, by this time, they had already done the first two miniseries that Ron Friedman had written. And as I mentioned, Ron had a really good agent. The animation writers were not protected by the Writers Guild. And as a result, there was no arbitration on final credits. And Ron, by the way, Ron is a wonderful guy. We're friends. I have no animosity. Don't read anything into this, please.
Yeah.
Ron's agent got him a deal where if he wrote the first draft of something, his name would be the only name on the script. And, that agent did exactly what an agent is supposed to do, represented the best interests of his client. So, I'm not blaming Ron for anything. So please don't read anything into this. But Ron wrote the first two miniseries, and I had seen them on television. And if you remember, these are the ones where, tanks are split in half by jets swooping down and slicing them with their wingtips. and you've got sergeants giving orders to colonels and things like this. And when Steve got assigned the story editor position, I contacted him, and Steve said, well, we've already staffed up. We've already got staff writers, and we're not taking freelance submissions right now. Said, but if I could, would you look at a couple of scripts and just give me some feedback? Because he knew I had been in the Army for 6 years. So I looked at him and I gave him, read them over, and I made some notes and gave them back. And basically I said, well, the people writing these don't understand how a military unit functions on a day-to-day basis. They don't understand the chain of command. There's a lot of technical stuff that is really wildly wrong in what they're doing. But best of luck. I hope it works, because they got some interesting characters. Steve called Sunbow and said, we really ought to hire Buzz as a technical advisor, because he was in the Army. He knows animation. He's a good person to have on this. And they said, well, we don't have any budget for a tech advisor, but we could squeeze in another staff writer. So I ended up becoming a staff writer and the de facto assistant story editor almost immediately. And almost every script that was written there, passed through my hands just to make sure, there were no egregious mistakes in it.
So would that have been what season would that have been? Because I know they did
first season.
So they did. I'm trying to remember the miniseries. Was it like the Weather Machine one or something like that? So they did a couple of those, and then that's when you came in. Okay.
Yeah, and then I was doing. I think we did 65 half-hour episodes. We did not write down. We never wrote down to our audience, and I think the reason Ruby Spears had a reputation of having the best story department was that we were striving to write up, and frequently our stuff would be edited down by somebody, but we were always writing at a higher level than the studios required.
This was I completely agree. This was my theory as a fan, right? So as a fan of the genre of animation that you were at its peak, right? I used, to me, the reason why Transformers and G.I. Joe worked was because it worked at two different levels as opposed to He-Man. He-Man, which I also watched, He-Man worked at a toy level better than it worked as a show level.
Mm-hmm.
Both Transformers and G.I. Joe had something over He-Man, and that was their toy lines were super impressive, but and diverse and really interesting, and you get really excited about the characters that they were creating in the toys. But then the shows themselves, separate from the toys, were just also fun and great to watch and engaging, and had a depth of storytelling that was different. Am I off base here? But
no, you were absolutely right, because one of the blessings in disguise for G.I. Joe was that when Marvel got the gig to do the G.I. Joe comic book, they handed it over to Larry Hama, and they basically took their hands off. They just went, yeah, this is just bread and butter money for us. We're not expecting anything of it. Yeah, do whatever you want. And ironically, I think there was another show, something about Gem, not our Gem, but Amherst or something like that. There was another miniseries that Marvel did with a female magic character in it that was like really well written. And it was because, nobody's paying attention. This is just a side gig. It's not our characters. We don't care. They handed it to Larry, and Larry also was a military vet. And Larry brought a level of sensibility to it that would not have gotten there with any other writer. And Larry was also an artist, so that he could block these stories out. He could show how they should be done. And Larry just did a great job with the G.I. Joe comic book. He also wrote the character bios that appeared on the backs of the cards.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
What you see on the back of the card is about 1/3 of the actual bio that Larry would write. We lucked out because Hasbro sent the full bios to us in the show Bible. And so we had these insights onto this wide diversity of characters that Larry had created. Then on top of that, we're bringing our own sensibilities into it, our own experiences. And everybody had a chance to use their own voice. We had a wide diversity of episodes because we had a wide diversity of writers. We had people with different interests, different points of view. Once we got the series underway, we had Transformers going 65 episodes. We had G.I. Joe going 65 episodes. We had at least one other show we were doing, which I think was a weekend show that was doing like 13 episodes. My Little Pony got introduced at some point in the proceedings.
Wow.
We, at one point, I remember we just totaled up the number of episodes that we had to do in a specific period of time, in like a 1-year period of time. And I think it was something like 160 episodes.
Wow.
And we were writing these things fast. Flint Dilley, who was more of a Transformers writer than a Joe writer, though he did write several Joe episodes. Flint said, you fix the 2 things in a script that you hate the most, you put a bow tie on it and you kick it out the door. Every day on whatever series you were working on, every day a finished script had to go through the door. I likened it to a slow-moving freight train. Mm. Every day an open boxcar came by you, and you had to throw something into that boxcar. And it had to be finished. If it was good, that was even better, but it had to be finished.
Now, how many of you? So out of 100, how many people are writing 160 plus episodes that year?
It's hard to say because despite having a staff writing pool, we ended up using a lot of freelancers.
I'm sure, yeah.
We had a few guys get burned out.
Yeah.
We had a few people who were in production positions who would write scripts on the side as necessary. Frequently, if you were writing for one show, you would get called to do another one. I mean, I think my name is on 3 Transformers scripts, but I'm pretty sure I contributed to many more than that. I mean, at least 6 scripts I wrote or rewrote for Transformers, and my name isn't on them because my point of view has always been, if I'm a story editor, it's not my place to put my name on somebody else's script.
Yeah, but you had your hand on all of these scripts that were coming in and out as
G.I. Joe, yeah,
story editor for G.I. Joe.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we move ahead to the year that they did the My Little Pony, Transformers, and G.I. Joe movies. And Hasbro had struck a deal with Dino De Laurentiis Productions that Dino promised you will have 3 shows on Saturday and 2 shows on Sunday if you do an animated feature. So Hasbro thought, well, that's, we can live with that. That'll be good enough. Hasbro wanted to introduce new characters to My Little Pony, Transformers, and G.I. Joe. And in retrospect, they recognized it's a mistake to introduce new characters in a feature film, because people coming to the feature film are coming to see the characters they already know and love. They don't want to be introduced to a brand new bunch. Introduce new characters in a regular season. We don't
want you to just indiscriminately murder Ironhide, one of my favorite. Don't even give him a chance to say a line and replace him with all the I'm sorry, I'm not bitter or anything. I'm not bitter. No. It's been 30 years.
Well,
so
we had the problem with G.I. Joe because I think Major Blood is in the opening credits and he's in the background in one scene and that's it.
Yes.
And I had to fight tooth and nail to give Shipwreck even a few lines. I mean, they were adamant they did not want to use Shipwreck, and I just hammered him in as hard as I could because I wasn't going to have a G.I. Joe movie that didn't have Shipwreck in it.
Love Shipwreck.
But what had happened was they had started 3 different scripts. I forget. I should have looked up who wrote the My Little Pony script, but Ron wrote the first draft of Ron wrote a first draft for a G.I. Joe movie. And Hasbro through Sunbow contacted me and said, you're a story editor. Would you take a look at the My Little Pony script and give us some feedback? And basically, I just pointed out places where, it would be good to have a song here about this sort of thing or that sort of thing. I mean, my contribution was small. I almost tied in My Little Pony with Transformers and G.I. Joe because at one point the little ponies are looking for help. And I wanted to have one of the little ponies fly to the Transformers base and ask them if they could help. And no, sorry. And then I wanted one to fly to G.I. Joe headquarters and, Shipwreck would be on the rear porch of the barracks drinking beer. And this little pony flies up. Gee, mister, can you help us? And, he's just looking in shock. And then as the pony flies off, he throws the beer away and takes the pledge not to drink again. And they shot that scene down. I didn't get a chance to tie it in. But anyway, I gave some feedback on the My Little Pony movie, but I no major contribution other than to suggest where songs could go. They gave me the G.I. Joe movie and said, we want to talk with you about it. Read it on the airplane flying to New York, and then we'll have a talk here in New York. So I get on the airplane, I read it on the airplane. I have the meeting with them in New York, and they say, well, what do you think we can do to fix this? And I said, I'll be brutally honest. I would advise throwing it out and starting from scratch. And I'm not saying this is a slam against Ron, but it just didn't capture what the series had evolved into. I think Ron was writing from what he remembered the show being when he was doing the miniseries. It had changed, obviously, by that point to something different.
Now, did his version even address or deal with the origins of Cobra, like the eventual film?
I cannot recall. Okay. I do know that one character he created, Nemesis Enforcer, was a big hit with everybody. And they thought, well, if we're going to salvage anything, salvage Nemesis Enforcer, the guy with the wings and the.
I love Nemesis Enforcer.
Yeah.
That's like a term of endearment in my household, like with my kids. They know about Nemesis Enforcer, especially Burgess Meredith saying it.
That's Ron, and give Ron all the credit. It was a good, imaginative character, and he came up with it. But anyway, they asked me to come up with a script for it. Now, again, you got to forgive me. I'm going to backtrack a little bit here. After the first season of G.I. Joe, it was picked up for a second season of 25 episodes. And then they would just rerun the previous season's episodes.
Yep.
And I had an idea that I pitched to Sunbow called The Most Dangerous Man in the World. And it was about the Karl Marx Friedrich Nietzsche of Cobra, the guy who had come up with the philosophy that Cobra was supposedly based on. But Cobra Commander had perverted the philosophy and he was doing it wrong. And he throws this guy in prison to keep him isolated so he can't be telling Cobra you're doing it wrong. The guy escapes from prison. Cobra ceases all worldwide activities to try to track this guy down. The Joes have no idea who he is or why he's important. They only know if Cobra wants him, they got to get him first. They catch him first. They realize he is this enormous pain in the ass, and he escapes from the Joes at the end of the episode. And the Joes basically go, you know what? He's out in the world causing problems for Cobra. We don't care. Let him go. And that was going to be my origin of Cobra. And it's different from Larry Hama's origin because the comic book G.I. Joe continuity is a separate continuity. It's two parallel but not identical continuities. I wrote this up and they accepted it and they said, yeah, I did an outline, go to script on it, just be sure to include the Cobra Emperor. And I said, the Cobra who? And they said, the Cobra Emperor. And I said, well, who's the Cobra Emperor? And they said, he's the leader of Cobra. And I said, no, he's not. I said, we've just done a whole season where we've established Cobra Commander as the supreme commander of Cobra. If you had told us, drop some clues, there might be somebody above him, we could have done that, but you didn't. So how do we explain where this guy comes from? And they go, good point. Come up with some ideas. So I've said this before. I tell young writers, if someone asks you to come up with a couple of ideas, don't. Come up with the idea you want to do, because if they could come up with ideas, they wouldn't be hiring you.
That's good.
So I came up with two ideas. One was became the origin of the miniseries Arise, Serpentor, Arise.
Oh, yeah.
Basically, they decide to create a new leader using DNA. The other was there's a secret organization or something, lost world type thing that has been funding Cobra all this time, and they're sick and tired of Cobra Commander screwing up. So they send Serpentor in. And Sunbow calls me and says, they love it, do it. And I said, do which one? They said, both. So we did Arise, Serpentor, Arise as the miniseries. And the one involving Cobra Law, that became the movie. And
Did you create Dr. Mindbender for that, or did they?
No, Mindbender was already around, but it was hard to find things for Dr. Mindbender to do. This was the first time he really had a story where he was germane to the plot and was actually contributing to it.
Yeah.
In any case, we do the G.I. Joe movie, and they were telling us, we want you to introduce all these brand new characters, and we're going to cycle out a bunch of the old characters. Now, they had done this before in the TV series and the miniseries. And typically, when they would cycle out an old character, they just disappeared from the show and a new character would come in. We did, however, on occasion, do references to the fact that these characters were cycled out. There's one G.I. Joe episode where they go to a parallel world where Cobra has won, and the characters that were being cycled out of the series at that point, they opt to stay in that world and continue the fight against Cobra. Sparks, the original communications guy for G.I. Joe, he came back in the second season as a civilian contractor, and somebody they contacted and said, hey, you worked on this before, can you give us any hints? And we established that they regularly cycle out of the G.I. Joe team and they go back to civilian life. So that way, if a kid, if a kid was missing a character, they could at least know, well, they finished their tour of duty and now they're civilians again. So they wanted to introduce a whole bunch of brand new characters, and they wanted to get rid of several of the old characters, including Duke.
I know.
They did not realize at that time they had a core group that you simply could not touch. There were characters that everybody wanted to see, and so you don't get rid of Duke. But anyway, they told me we're cycling Duke out, and I said, well, we've been doing a war show for like 2 years now, and we've had all this combat, and we've had characters get injured, but they always get better and come back. We've never actually killed anybody. And this is a movie, and it's big, and you're getting Duke out of the product line. Let's let Duke go with a heroic death, and they go, yeah, that's a good idea. So they let me write Duke's death, where he sacrifices himself to save Lieutenant Falcon, his half-brother. Okay? And Hasbro liked it so much, they told the guys doing Transformers, kill off Optimus Prime, because we're taking him out of the toy line too.
Are you serious? So it worked reverse. So the death of Duke inspired the death of Optimus Prime. I did not know that.
Exactly. What happened though was this, and Hasbro later said they made a mistake. They should have released the movies in reverse order. They should have started with G.I. Joe, then Transformers, then finished up with My Little Pony. The deal, as I told you, that they had with De Laurentiis was that they would release a new movie every month that summer. And they would start with the My Little Pony movie. And, you know, My Little Pony's audience, they're little kids, 6 years old, 8 years old, have to come to the movies with their parents. And there's nothing in the My Little Pony movie that is traumatic. Okay. It's a good, fun kids animated movie. It's perfectly in tune with the My Little Pony universe. I wrote My Little Pony episodes, and you know, it was a fun show to write, and you know, I enjoyed it. Transformers, their target audience was roughly 9 years of age, and 9-year-olds were more likely to have to go to the movies with their parents than 12-year-olds. G.I. Joe's target audience was 12. A 12-year-old intellectually understands war is deadly. People get killed in war. If they're watching a war movie and a character gets killed, they are old enough to know intellectually that's a possibility. It might sadden them, it might shock them, but it's within the realm of possibility to them. 9-year-olds have just been watching this fun show every day, and it's bright and colorful, and they really like it. But they haven't yet wrapped their mind around the finality of death. And as I pointed out to Hasbro at the time, you really can't kill a robot. You can run them over with a steamroller, you can chop them up into little bits, you can do all kinds of things to them, and you can always repair them and put them back together.
Right. I remember even as a fan, right, we would always, you'd always laugh because everyone on both shows, they're shooting laser guns at each other.
Yeah.
And when a Transformer gets hit, when an Autobot gets shot by a Decepticon, you know, they're a robot. So you see them fall down, and then you see them laying there and their friend picks them up. In G.I. Joe, we never understood how you could get shot by a laser and then they could just get up and keep moving. So you're right. Like even as a kid, you understood that there was a difference between a giant robot getting shot and with a person getting shot.
Right. So the Transformer movie came out first. The My Little Pony movie came out first. The Transformer movie came out second. You had all of these really revved up 9-year-olds dragging their parents to see the Transformer movie. And I felt sorry for the parents, because the parents are in this theater trapped in what to them looks like an acid flashback from the 1960s. They have no idea what's going on. The dialogue might as well be in High Martian for all they can understand it. And then all of a sudden, every kid in the theater starts screaming and weeping. And they're going, what? What happened? What's the matter? I killed Optimus Prime, and it's just... there was actually a kid in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, we heard, that had locked himself in a closet for a couple of days because he was just so traumatized by this.
Now, was that 85? Did it come out in 85?
Yeah, I think it was.
So I was, just so you know, I was 9. I was 9. I was the target audience. I was 9 years old. My sister took me, and she was 13. And she got angry. As a 13-year-old, she got angry, not like cried. She got angry that they would kill off Optimus Prime. I remember it well.
So anyway, the edict immediately came down: do not kill Duke in the movie. So they very, very clumsily introduced 2 lines of dialogue. He's in a coma, and then at the end of the movie, he's good news, he's out of the coma. No, I killed that sucker dead.
I love that. That was one of my all-time favorite moments as a kid. is hearing, he's in a coma, like off camera. And it was like, what? There's blood splattering everywhere. Who gets into a coma being stabbed into the heart? I never understood that.
Yeah,
Great.
Anyway.
So the Transformers movie came out and there was this reaction. And they said, go make the change, add this dialogue. So the film had already been animated, already been made, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so they just threw this line of dialogue in.
Yeah.
Did they end up releasing? Because I don't remember seeing the G.I. Joe movie. They didn't even release it in theaters, did they?
No, because what happened was De Laurentiis double-crossed Hasbro. And instead of 3 shows on Saturday and 2 on Sunday, they only got 2 shows on Saturday and 1 on Sunday. And that's like a 40% drop in box office revenue right there. And I forget exactly what happened, if there was a lawsuit or anything like that, but basically the distribution deal evaporated. And G.I. Joe, the movie, was never released in 1985. We had one screening at San Diego Comic-Con where we had a work print and they got the reels out of order in the work print.
Oh, no.
Yeah. And then it just went straight to video. I mean, it was re-edited into another miniseries and put.
Yeah, that's how I remember it. Is it came out as a 5-part? I feel like it was like the premiere. It was like premiere week in '86 or '87 or something.
Right.
The five that like a whole week. It was a whole week of the G.I.
Yeah.
They called it G.I. Joe the movie. So when you wrote that, that opening sequence is fantastic. Was that your like? That opening sequence is a little mini kind of a best of hits. Just that the fact that they decided to do a song, a music comes, and just the way it was. I just to this day, I think
that is all. I want to give credit where it is due. That is all Larry Houston's work.
It was great.
Larry did a great job. It would have been wonderful if the whole movie could have lived up to that energy.
Yeah. The animation was so clean and slick, and it was a great story. It was all really good.
Yeah. My portion starts. The script that I wrote starts with outside the terror drome as Pythona is creeping up to infiltrate the terror drome.
Well, Buzz, this has been fantastic. I've learned so much about this world,
James.
and I just love talking with you. And I know we could talk for another 2 hours on all the other stuff that we didn't get to cover. But I think that for our audience, the fact that to know the intricacies of animated television, that because of all the kids that grew up on what you wrote are now animators and storytellers and filmmakers themselves, and you've really made an impact in that way. So thank you so very much, not only for what you've written and what you contributed to, but for being with us today. We always like to close our podcast by praying for our guests. Would you allow me to pray for you?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Heavenly Father, we just thank you for today, and thank you for Buzz, and thank you for just such amazing stories and such an amazing career. And God, just thank you for just his kindness to be able to share with us today. God, I pray just a prayer of blessing over Buzz and his life and his family. God, thank you for just the chance that we have to just learn from him. And God, we just pray that you give back to him tenfold that he gives to others. And just thank you for this opportunity. And we pray this in Jesus' name and your promises we stand. Amen.
Thank you for listening to the Act One podcast, celebrating over 20 years as the premier training program for Christians in Hollywood. Act One is a Christian community of entertainment industry professionals who train and equip storytellers to create works of truth, goodness, and beauty. The Act One program is a division of Master Media International. To financially support the mission of Act One or to learn more about our programs, visit us online at actoneprogram.com. And to learn more about the work of Master Media, go to mastermedia.com.